Some people don't break in front of you, they break within themselves, quietly, slowly, without ever showing it on the surface. There are no loud arguments, no emotional scenes, no clear warning signs. One day they're there, and the next day, they're gone. Not because they didn't care, but because they cared deeply and learned to hide it. Silence, for them, is not emptiness, it's protection. The strongest people often carry more than they reveal. They are used to handling things on their own, solving their own problems, and processing pain without asking for help. Over time, this becomes a habit. They stop expressing what they feel, not because they don't have emotions, but because they don't feel safe sharing them. They've learned that vulnerability is often misunderstood, ignored, or even used against them. So instead of explaining, they withdraw. Instead of reacting, they disappear. Sometimes, they leave to protect you. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in a quiet decision that says, I don't want to bring my chaos into your peace. They feel their struggles are too heavy, too complicated, or too unresolved to share. So they carry it alone. They believe distancing themselves is better than becoming a burden. And while that may seem like strength from the outside, it often comes from a place of deep emotional weight. Other times, they leave to protect themselves. They recognize patterns. Situations where they feel drained, unheard, or unvalued, and instead of fighting for understanding, they choose silence. Not because they don't want to fix things, but because they are tired of explaining themselves. Tired of repeating what isn't being heard. Tired of giving energy where it doesn't return. And then there's the part most people don't see, they're not always running away from others. Sometimes, they are trying to find themselves again. To rebuild clarity. To process everything they've been holding inside for too long. Because when you've been strong for so long without release, silence becomes the only place where you can finally face what you've been avoiding. So when someone leaves without a word, it's rarely simple. It's not just distance, it's a decision built over time. A mix of protection, exhaustion, and unspoken emotions. And the truth is, the quietest exits often carry the deepest stories, the ones that were never said out loud. There is a quiet strength that rarely gets recognized because it doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need an audience, it doesn't ask for sympathy, and it doesn't announce its struggles. These are the people who keep going even when they're exhausted, who hold everything together even when they feel like falling apart. They've trained themselves to stay composed, to show up, to carry more than they should, without letting it show. And because they make it look easy, no one really stops to ask what it costs them. They become the ones others rely on. The steady presence. The problem solver. The listener. The strong one. But over time, that role becomes heavy. Not because they can't handle it, but because they're handling it alone. They don't speak up, not because they don't need support, but because they've learned that their pain is often misunderstood, dismissed, or simply unheard. So instead of repeating themselves, they stay silent. Not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. And that silence, it's not empty at all. It's full of things they never said. Every time they held back instead of opening up. Every time they chose peace over confrontation. Every time they carried something they should have shared. It builds quietly inside them until one day, something shifts. They stop explaining. They stop trying to be understood. They stop giving energy where it isn't felt. From the outside, it may look like distance. Like they've changed. But in reality, they've just reached a point where silence feels safer than expression. Where protecting their peace matters more than being heard. And in that silence, they begin to reclaim themselves, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that only they truly understand. Strong people often carry a depth that isn't visible on the surface. They don't just hear words, they feel the tone behind them, the intention within them, the shift that most people overlook. Small changes don't go unnoticed. A different energy, a delayed response, a subtle distance, they register everything. And because they process things deeply, what seems small to others can stay with them for a long time. But instead of expressing that weight openly, they hold it inside. Not because they don't want to share, but because they've learned that not everyone understands that depth. So they choose silence over explanation, calm over conflict. They don't react to everything they feel. They absorb it, analyze it, and carry it quietly. On the outside, they appear composed. On the inside, there's a constant processing happening. They also have a habit of protecting others from their own struggles. They don't want to become a burden. They don't want to shift the emotional weight onto someone else. So they keep showing up, keep giving, keep being present for others, even when they themselves feel heavy. That's why their silence is often misunderstood. People assume they are unaffected, when in reality, they are just controlled. And over time, this creates a kind of hidden strength. The ability to feel deeply without losing control. The ability to stay calm while carrying internal storms. But it also comes with a cost, because when everything is processed internally, it can become isolating. That's why their silence is not emptiness. It's depth. It's awareness. It's emotion that has been shaped into control. And behind that calm presence is someone who feels more than they show, and understands more than they ever say. They don't choose to fight alone at first, it becomes a pattern over time. When support is inconsistent, when understanding feels rare, when asking for help leads to disappointment, something shifts. They stop reaching out. Not because they don't need support, but because they stop expecting it. And from that point, independence is no longer a choice, it becomes a survival skill. They learn to rely on their own thinking, their own judgment, their own ability to handle pressure. Decisions are made alone. Problems are solved alone. Even emotional breakdowns happen in private, where no one can see the weight they're carrying. Over time, they become their own support system. They fix what hurts without asking for help. They adapt to silence. They become comfortable handling things internally, even when it's heavy. This builds strength, but it also builds distance. Because when you get used to fighting alone, it becomes difficult to let anyone in. Trust becomes harder. Vulnerability feels risky. You start believing that depending on others is a weakness, even when it's not. So you keep everything controlled, everything contained. And while this creates resilience, it also creates isolation. Because being your own safety net means you rarely fall, but it also means you rarely allow anyone to catch you. That's the trade-off. Strength built through solitude is powerful, but it carries a quiet loneliness that most people never see. Still, this kind of person doesn't break easily. They've already faced things alone. They've already learned how to stand without support. And that's why, even in silence, even in distance, they remain strong. Not because life was easy for them, but because they learned how to survive it on their own. At first, they try. They explain clearly, they repeat themselves, they simplify their words, hoping that this time they'll be understood. But when the same conversations lead to the same misunderstandings, something changes. It stops feeling like communication and starts feeling like effort without return. And over time, that effort becomes exhausting. They begin to realize that not everyone listens to understand, some listen to respond, to judge, or to defend their own view. And no matter how clearly you speak, you can't force understanding where there is no willingness. That's when they stop trying to convince. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they see no value in repeating what isn't being heard. Choosing silence becomes a form of protection. They withdraw from conversations that drain them, not out of pride, but out of awareness. They understand that constantly explaining themselves doesn't bring clarity, it only drains their energy. So instead, they focus on preserving their mental space. They accept that some people won't understand them, and they stop needing them to. This is where a quiet shift happens. They stop choosing being right over being at peace. They stop engaging in every discussion. They become more selective with their words, their time, and their energy. And in that silence, they regain control, not over others, but over themselves. Because in the end, silence is not giving up. It's knowing when explaining is no longer worth it, and choosing peace instead. At first, giving feels natural to them. They show up when others are struggling, they listen without interrupting, they offer support without being asked. They don't keep score, they don't expect anything in return, they just give. Because that's who they are. Loyalty, care, presence, it comes from a genuine place, not from obligation. But over time, something starts to feel off. The effort is not matched. The energy is not returned. They are always the one reaching out, always the one understanding, always the one staying. Even when it hurts. And slowly, they begin to notice a pattern. They are pouring into people who are not pouring back. At first, they ignore it. They tell themselves it's okay. They justify others' behavior. They stay patient. They forgive. But giving without receiving eventually turns into exhaustion. Not because they regret being kind, but because they realize they've been neglecting themselves in the process. That's when the shift begins. They stop overgiving. They stop prioritizing others at the cost of their own peace. They start setting quiet boundaries, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. They begin to understand that real connection is mutual, not one-sided. And the hardest truth they accept is this: not everyone who receives your loyalty deserves it. Not everyone who takes your energy values it. So instead of giving endlessly, they become intentional. They give where it's respected. They stay where it's reciprocated. Because in the end, their kindness doesn't disappear, it becomes selective. And that's not weakness. That's growth. They learn early that showing pain doesn't always bring comfort, sometimes it brings judgment, misunderstanding, or silence. So instead of opening up, they adapt. They build a version of themselves that looks strong on the outside, even when everything inside feels heavy. They smile when they're expected to, they show up when needed, and they carry on as if nothing is wrong. Not because they are unaffected, but because they've trained themselves to handle it alone. Strength becomes their shield. They don't want sympathy, they don't want to be seen as fragile, and they don't want to place their struggles on others. So they mask it well. They hide their exhaustion behind calmness, their pain behind composure, their battles behind silence. People see them as stable, reliable, unshaken, but they don't see what it takes to maintain that image every single day. They keep their hardest moments private. The breakdowns happen where no one can witness them. The thoughts stay unspoken. The pressure stays internal. And over time, this creates a quiet kind of suffering, one that doesn't look dramatic, but feels constant. Because when everything is held inside, there's no release, only endurance. But this doesn't mean they are weak, it means they are controlled. They've mastered how to carry pain without letting it spill into everything else. Still, even the strongest people need space to breathe, to be understood, to not always be the one holding everything together. And that's the part most people miss. Behind that strength is not someone who feels less, it's someone who feels deeply, but chooses silence over exposure. Someone who suffers quietly, not for attention, but because they've learned that not every pain needs to be seen to be real. At some point, they realize that not every situation deserves a reaction. Not every comment deserves a reply. Not every conflict deserves their time. And that realization changes how they move through life. They stop engaging in arguments that lead nowhere, stop explaining themselves to people who don't want to understand, and stop giving energy to situations that only create stress. They begin to choose calm over chaos, not because they can't handle conflict, but because they see no value in it. They understand that many arguments are driven by ego, not truth. And once you see that, it becomes easier to walk away. Not as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of control. Because staying silent when you could react takes more strength than reacting without thinking. They also become more protective of their energy. They notice what drains them, certain people, certain conversations, certain environments, and they quietly distance themselves. They don't need to make noise about it, they don't need to announce it. They just remove themselves and focus on what keeps them grounded. This doesn't mean they avoid everything. It means they choose carefully. If something truly matters, they will show up. But if it's just noise, they let it pass. They no longer feel the need to prove a point, win an argument, or defend every opinion. And in that shift, they find something most people are still chasing: peace. Not temporary calm, but a steady, controlled state where they are no longer pulled into every distraction. Because when you stop reacting to everything, you finally have the space to focus on what actually matters. They understand that words can be polished, but behavior cannot be faked for long. So they pay attention to actions more than promises. They watch how people behave when things are easy, and more importantly, how they behave when things become difficult. That's where truth usually shows itself, not in statements, but in consistency. Because they speak less, they observe more. Silence gives them space to notice details others rush past. A shift in tone, a change in energy, a repeated pattern in behavior, these small things start forming a bigger picture. They don't jump to conclusions quickly, but they do collect information quietly. Over time, understanding becomes clearer without the need for confrontation. They also learn to trust patterns instead of emotions. Words can create temporary impressions, but repeated actions reveal intent. That's why they wait. They don't rush to label people or situations. They let time confirm what they are seeing. And in that patience, they avoid many mistakes that come from reacting too early. This habit changes how they move through life. They stop reacting to everything immediately and start responding only when it's necessary. Not out of fear, but out of control. Because when you understand more, you don't need to speak more. You only act when it actually matters. And that is where their strength comes from. Not from speaking less for show, but from understanding more in silence. They don't waste energy fighting reality. When something changes, they notice it early. When something ends, they don't pretend it's still the same. They understand that holding on to denial only delays pain, it doesn't remove it. So instead of resisting what is already happening, they face it directly, even when it's uncomfortable. They also accept that people change. Feelings shift, priorities shift, connections fade. Instead of forcing things to stay the same, they observe what is actually real in the present moment. If something is over, they don't chase it. They don't keep reaching for what has already moved away. They understand that not everything is meant to last, and forcing it only creates more distance. Closure is another thing they learn to live without. They don't always get explanations, apologies, or final conversations. But they don't let that stop their progress. They stop waiting for answers that may never come and instead focus on moving forward with what they already know. That acceptance gives them speed in recovery that others struggle to find. They don't beg for attention or try to hold on to situations that are clearly slipping away. Instead, they quietly step back. Not in bitterness, but in awareness. They recognize when effort is no longer mutual, when energy is no longer balanced, and when staying would only drain them further. And when they let go, they don't make noise about it. They don't announce it, argue it, or dramatize it. They simply detach and begin rebuilding. Slowly, quietly, and with focus. Because for them, acceptance is not defeat, it's the first step toward becoming stronger again. They understand that growth doesn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, almost invisible. One day, they simply notice that the people, habits, and environments they once related to no longer feel aligned. Not because those things changed overnight, but because they did. Instead of forcing connection, they allow distance to happen naturally. There is no need for arguments, announcements, or emotional explanations. They simply feel the shift and respond to it calmly. Communication becomes less frequent, not out of anger, but out of awareness. Energy is no longer invested where it doesn't match their direction. They start prioritizing their own development without needing permission or approval. Old patterns begin to feel unnecessary. Old conversations feel repetitive. Old versions of themselves no longer fit the life they are building. So they quietly step away, not to prove anything, but to protect their progress. And the most powerful part is how silently it happens. No big exit. No emotional scene. Just a gradual shift into a different mindset, a different focus, a different level of thinking. They don't hold on out of habit, and they don't stay out of comfort. They move because they understand that staying in the same environment often keeps you the same person. So they leave without noise. Not because they are lost, but because they are evolving. And when people look back later, they don't see drama or conflict, they simply realize that someone quietly outgrew everything that no longer matched who they were becoming. Their silence is not emptiness, it is conclusion. They reach a point where arguments no longer feel meaningful, not because they have nothing to say, but because they understand that saying more won't change anything. Explaining their feelings again and again starts to feel like repeating themselves into spaces that were never truly listening. So they stop, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Emotionally, they begin to detach. Not in a cold way, but in a protective way. They stop investing energy where it constantly drains them. They accept what cannot be changed, not because it is easy, but because resisting reality costs more than accepting it. And in that acceptance, they find a strange kind of relief. Quietly, they close doors. No announcements, no explanations, no final debates. Just distance. Just less availability. Just withdrawal from anything that no longer aligns with their peace. It is not a performance, it is a decision made internally, long before it becomes visible externally. Eventually, they choose themselves without guilt. They find comfort in solitude, not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped abandoning themselves for the sake of being understood. In that space, they begin to rebuild, slowly, silently, without needing validation or attention. And that is where their silence becomes powerful. Because at that stage, absence is no longer confusion. It is communication. It says what words could not: I am no longer where I was, and I will not return to what broke me. Have you ever gone silent, not because you had nothing to say, but because you felt no one was truly listening? Silence is not emptiness. It is the loudest truth spoken by a tired soul. If this content gave you value, take a moment to reflect on it and apply what actually resonates with you in real life. If you want to support the channel, you can like the video, follow, and subscribe. And if you have your thoughts on it, share them in the comments. Your perspective might add something meaningful to the conversation.